It happened that about this time I received word from Miss Havisham that Estella was home, and that Miss Havisham wished me to see her. It was clear that I must repair to our town next day. I arrived at the gate of Satis House at my old time, and rang the bell with an unsteady hand. When the gate swung on its rusty hinges, I started to find myself confronted by a man in sober grey, the last man I should have expected to see in that place of porter at Miss Havisham's door. "Orlick." "Ah, young master, there's more changes than yours." "How did you come here?" "I come here my legs." "Are you here for good?" "I ain't here for harm, young master, I suppose." "Then have you left the forge?" "Do this look like a forge? Now do it look like it?" I asked him how long he had left Gargery's forge. "One day's so like another here that I don't know without casting it up. However, I come here some time since you left." "I could have told you that, Orlick." "Ah, but then you've got to be a scholar." By this time we had come to the house. "Well, shall I go up to Miss Havisham?" "Burn me if I know." "I am expected, I believe." "Burn me twice over if I can say." Upon that I turned down the long passage which I had first trodden in my thick boots. I tapped in my old way at the door of Miss Havisham's room. "Pip's rap," I heard her say. "Come in, Pip." She was in her chair near the old table, in the old dress, with her two hands crossed on her stick, her chin resting on them, and her eyes on the fire. Sitting near her was an elegant lady, whom I had never seen. "I heard, Miss Havisham, that you were so kind as to wish me to come and see you, and I came directly." "Well?" The lady, whom I had never seen before, lifted up her eyes and looked archly at me, and then I saw that the eyes were Estella's eyes. But she was so much changed, was so much more beautiful, and so much more womanly. I fancied, as I looked at her, that I slipped hopelessly back into the coarse and common boy again. Oh, the sense of distance and disparity that came upon me, and the inaccessibility that came about her. "Do you find her much changed, Pip? She was proud and insulting, and you wanted to go away from her. Don't you remember?" I said confusedly that that was long ago, and that I knew no better then. Estella smiled with perfect composure. "Is he changed?" "Very much." "Less coarse and common?" Estella laughed and looked at me. She treated me as a boy still, but she lured me on. We sat in the dreamy room among the old strange influences which had so wrought upon me, and I learnt that she had but just come home from France, and that she was going to London. When we had conversed for a while, Miss Havisham said in a whisper to me, "Is she beautiful, graceful, well-grown? Do you admire her?" "Everybody must who sees her, Miss Havisham." She drew an arm round my neck and drew my head close down to hers as she sat in the chair. "Love her, love her, love her. If she favours you, love her. If she wounds you, love her. If she tears your heart to pieces, love her, love her, love her." I could feel the muscles of the thin arm round my neck well with the vehemence that possessed her. "Hear me, Pip. I adopted her to be loved. I bred her and educated her to be loved. I developed her into what she is, that she might be loved. Love her!" She said the word often enough, and there could be no doubt that she meant to say it. But if the often repeated word had been hate instead of love, despair, revenge, dire death, it could not have sounded from her lips more like a curse. It was arranged that when Estella came to London I should be forewarned of her coming, and should meet her at the coach. And then I took leave of her, and touched her hand, and left her. Then one day, when I was busy with my books, I received a note by the post. It had no set beginning, as "Dear Mr. Pip," or "Dear Pip," or anything, but ran thus: "I am to come to London the day after tomorrow by the midday coach. I believe it was settled you should meet me. She sends you her regard. Yours, Estella. The coach came promptly, and I saw her face at the coach window and her hand waving to me. In her furred travelling dress, Estella seemed more delicately beautiful than she had ever seemed yet, even in my eyes. Her manner was more winning than she had cared to let it be to me before, and I thought I saw Miss Havisham's influence in the change. "I'm going to Richmond. I'm going to live at a great expense with a lady there, an old friend of Miss Havisham, who has the power, or says she has, of taking me about and introducing me and showing people to me and showing me to people." "I suppose you will be glad of variety and admiration." "Yes, I suppose so." "I wonder Miss Havisham could part with you again so soon." "It is a part of Miss Havisham's plans for me, Pip." It was the first time she had ever called me by my name. Of course she did so purposely, and knew that I should treasure it up. As I am now generalizing a period of my life with the object of clearing my way before me, I can scarcely do so better than by at once completing the description of our usual manners and customs at Barnard's Inn, by saying simply that we spent as much money as we could, and got as little for it as people could make up their minds to give us. We had fallen into our customary serene state one evening, when we heard a letter dropped through the slit in the door, and fall on the ground. "It's for you, Handel," said Herbert. "I hope there's nothing the matter." This was in allusion to its heavy black seal and border. The letter was signed Trabb and Co., and its contents were simply that I was an honoured sir, and that they begged to inform me that Mrs. J. Gargery had departed this life on Monday last at 20 minutes past 6 in the evening, and that my attendance was requested at the interment on Monday next at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At this time I devoted much thought to how my expectations might benefit Herbert. At last I informed Wemmick that I was anxious in behalf of Herbert Pocket, and sought advice from his experience and knowledge of men and affairs, how I could best try, with my resources, to help Herbert to some present income, say of 100 a year, to keep him in good home and heart, and gradually to buy him on to some small partnership. I begged Wemmick, in conclusion, to understand that my help must always be rendered without Herbert's knowledge or suspicion, and that there was no one else in the world with whom I could advise. Wemmick was silent for a little while, and then said, with a kind of start, "Mr. Pip, I'll put on my considering cap, and I think all you want to do may be done by degrees. There's an accountant and agent I know. I'll look him up and go to work for you." The upshot was that we found a worthy young merchant or shipping broker, not long established in business, who wanted intelligent help, and who wanted capital, and who, in due course of time and receipt, would want a partner. The whole business was so cleverly managed that Herbert had not the least suspicion of my hand being in it. I never shall forget the radiant face with which he came home one afternoon and told me his mighty piece of news. I did really cry in good earnest when I went to bed, to think that my expectations had done some good to somebody. It is impossible to turn this leaf of my life without putting Bentley Drummle's name upon it, or I would very gladly. It happened that Herbert and I found ourselves one evening dining with Drummle and Startop. Drummle rose to propose a toast. What was my indignant surprise when he called upon the company to pledge him to Estella. "Estella who?" I said. "Never you mind." "Estella of where?" "Of Richmond, gentlemen, and a peerless beauty." Much he knew about peerless beauties, a mean, miserable idiot, I whispered to Herbert. "I know that lady," said Herbert across the table when the toast had been honoured. "Do you?" said Drummle. "And so do I," I added with a scarlet face. "Do you?" said Drummle. "Oh, Lord!" I tell this lightly, but it was no light thing to me, for I cannot adequately express what pain it gave me to think that Estella should show any favour to a contemptible, clumsy, sulky booby so very far below the average. I was 23 years of age. Not another word had I heard to enlighten me on the subject of my expectations. Business had taken Herbert on a journey to Marseille. I was alone, and had a dull sense of being alone. It was wretched weather, stormy and wet. I was reading, and all the many church clocks in the city, some leading, some accompanying, some following, struck the hour of 11. The sound was curiously flawed by the wind, and I was listening and thinking how the wind assailed and tore it, when I heard a footstep on the stair. I took up my reading lamp and went out to the stair head. "There's someone down there, is there not?"
"Yes."
"What floor do you want?"
"The top. Mr. Pip."
"That is my name." And the man came on. I dimly saw a face looking up with an incomprehensible air of being touched and pleased by the sight of me. I made out that he was substantially dressed, but roughly, like a voyager by sea. His age was about 60. I saw, with a stupid kind of amazement, that he was holding out both his hands to me. "Pray, what is your business?"
"My business? Ah, yes. I will explain my business by your leave."
"Do you wish to come in?"
"Yes, I wish to come in, master."
I took him into the room I had just left, and having set the lamp on the table, asked him as civilly as I could to explain himself. Once more he was holding out both his hands to me. And suddenly I knew him. If the wind and the rain had driven away the intervening years, had scattered all the intervening objects, had swept us to the churchyard where we first stood face to face on such different levels, I could not have known my convict more distinctly than I knew him now, as he stood before me. I reluctantly gave him my hands. He grasped them heartily, raised them to his lips, kissed them, and still held them.
"You acted noble, my boy. Noble, Pip, and I have never forgot it."
At a change in his manner, as if he were even going to embrace me, I laid a hand upon his breast and put him away. "Stay, keep off. If you are grateful to me for what I did when I was a little child, I hope you have shown your gratitude by mending your way of life. If you have come here to thank me, it was not necessary. Still, you are wet, and you look weary. Will you drink something before you go?" I made him some hot rum and water. When at last I put the glass to him, I saw, with amazement, that his eyes were full of tears. "I hope that you will not think I spoke harshly to you just now. I had no intention of doing it, and I am sorry for it if I did. I wish you well and happy." He stretched out his hand. I gave him mine, and then he drank. "How are you living?"
"I've been a sheep farmer, stock breeder, other trades besides, away in the New World, many 1,000 mile of stormy water off from this."
"I hope you have done well."
"I've done wonderful well."
"I'm glad to hear it."
"I hope to hear you say so, my dear boy. May I make so bold as to ask you how you have done well, since you and me was out on them lone shivering marshes?"
I forced myself to tell him that I had been chosen to succeed to some property.
"Might a mere warmint ask what property?"
I faltered, I don't know."
"Might a mere warmint ask whose property?"
I faltered again. "I don't know."
"Could I make a guess, I wonder, concerning your guardian?"
My heart beat like a heavy hammer.
"Some lawyer, maybe, whose name might be Jaggers?"
I could not have spoken one word, though it had been to save my life.
"Yes, Pip, dear boy, I've made a gentleman on you. It's me what has done it. I swore that time sure as ever I earned a guinea, that guinea should go to you. I swore afterwards, sure as ever I speculated and got rich, you should get rich. I lived rough that you should live smooth. I worked hard that you should be above work. What odds, dear boy? Do I tell it for you to feel a obligation? Not a bit. I tell it for you to know as that there hunted dunghill dog what you kept life in got his head so high that he could make a gentleman. And, Pip, you're him."
Again he took both my hands and put them to his lips, while my blood ran cold within me. I tried to collect my thoughts, but I was stunned. Presently he asked, "Where will you put me? I must be put somewheres, dear boy, to sleep, for I've been sea-tossed and sea-washed months and months." "My friend and companion is absent. You must have his room."
"He won't come back tomorrow, will he?"
"No, not tomorrow."
"Because, looky here, dear boy, caution is necessary."
"How do you mean, caution?"
"I was sent for life. It's death to come back, and I should of a certainty be hanged if took."
Nothing was needed but this. The wretched man, after loading wretched me with his gold and silver chains for years, had risked his life to come to me, and I held it there, in my keeping. For an hour or more after he retired, I remained too stunned to think, and it was not until I began to think that I began fully to know how wrecked I was, and how the ship in which I had sailed was gone to pieces. Miss Havisham's intentions towards me all a mere dream. Estella not designed for me. I only suffered in Satis House as a convenience, a sting for the greedy relations, a model with a mechanical heart to practice on. Those were the first of my pangs. But sharpest and deepest pain of all, it was for the convict, guilty of I knew not what crimes, that I had deserted Joe. The impossibility of keeping my dreaded visitor concealed in the chambers was self-evident. It could not be done, and the attempt to do it would inevitably engender suspicion. It was then I heard a second noise outside my chambers. Groping my way down the dark staircase, I fell over something, and that something was a man crouching in a corner. The man made no answer when I asked him what he did there, but eluded my touch in silence and disappeared into the darkness. It troubled me that there should have been a lurker on the stairs on that night of all nights in the year, and I fell to wondering the identity of the silent intruder. In the morning the convict and I talked further. "I do not even know," said I, "by what name to call you. I shall give out that you are my uncle."
"That's it, dear boy. Call me uncle."
"You assumed some name, I suppose, on board ship?"
"Yes, dear boy. I took the name of Provis."
"Do you mean to keep that name?"
"Why, yes, dear boy, it's as good as another, unless you'd like another."
"What is your real name?"
"Magwitch, christened Abel."
"What were you brought up to be?"
"A warmint, dear boy."
He answered quite seriously, and used the word as if it denoted some profession. "When you came here last night—"
"Yes, dear boy."
"When you came in, had you anyone with you?"
"With me? No, dear boy."
"But there was someone there?"
"I didn't take particular notice, but I think there was a person, too, come in along of me."
"Were you known in London?"
"Not over and above, dear boy. I was in the provinces mostly."
"Were you tried in London?"
"Which time?"
"The last time." He nodded.
"First knowed Mr. Jaggers that way. Jaggers was for me."
It appeared to me that I could do no better than secure him some quiet lodging hard by, of which he might take possession when Herbert returned, whom I expected in 2 or 3 days. The secret must be confided to Herbert as a matter of unavoidable necessity. In vain should I attempt to describe the astonishment and disquiet of my dear friend when he and I and Provis sat down before the fire, and I recounted the whole of the secret. When Provis was safely in his new lodgings, and I returned to our chambers, Herbert received me with open arms, and I had never felt before so blessedly what it is to have a friend. When he had spoken some sound words of sympathy and encouragement, we sat down to consider the question. What was to be done? "My poor dear Handel, I'm too stunned to think." So was I, Herbert, when the blow first fell. Still something must be done. He is intent upon various new expenses, horses and carriages and lavish appearance of all kinds. He must be stopped somehow. You mean that you can't accept? How can I? Think of him. Look at him. An involuntary shudder passed over both of us. Yet I am afraid the dreadful truth is, Herbert, that he is attached to me, strongly attached to me. Was there ever such a fate? Oh, my poor dear Hansel! Then again, I'm heavily in debt, very heavily for me, who have now no expectations, and I have been bred to no calling, and I am fit for nothing. Well, don't say fit for nothing. You could work in Clarica's house. I'm working up towards a partnership, you know. Poor fellow, he little suspected with whose money. Herbert continued, but there is another question. This is an ignorant, determined man who has long had one fixed idea. If you cut the ground from under his feet, destroy his idea, imagine what he might do under the disappointment. I have imagined Herbert, and dreamed of it ever since the fatal night of his arrival. Nothing has been in my thoughts so distinctly as his putting himself in the way of being taken. Then that is his power over you, as long as he remains in England, and that would be his reckless course if you forsook him. I was struck by the horror of this idea. What was to be done? The first and the main thing to be done is to get him out of England. You will have to go with him, and then he may be induced to go. When my convict and benefactor was next with us, I prevailed upon him to tell his life story to us, beginning with our first encounter and the second convict who was with him then.
Dear boy, and Pip's comrade, I'm not a-going for to tell you my life like a song or a storybook, but to give it you short and handy. I'll put it at once into a mouthful of English. In jail and out of jail, in jail and out of jail, in jail and out of jail. There, you've got it. That's my life pretty much, down to such times as I got shipped off after Pip stood my friend. So far as I could find, there weren't a soul that see young Abel Magwitch with as little on him as in him but what caught fright at him, and either drove him off or took him up. I was took up to that extent that I regularly growed up took up. Once, at Epsom races at an inn, a matter of over 20 years ago, I got acquainted with a man whose skull I'd crack with this poker, if I got it on this hob. His right name was Compeyson, and that's the man, dear boy, what you see me a-pounding in the ditch. He's set up for a gentleman, this Compeyson, and he'd been to a public boarding school and had learning. He was a smooth one to talk, and was a dab at the ways of gentlefolks. He was good-looking, too. Compeyson, he looks at me very noticing, and I looks at him. To judge from appearances, you're out of luck, says Compeyson to me. Yes, master, and I've never been in it much. Luck changes, says Compeyson. Perhaps yours is going to change. And Compeyson took me on to be his man and partner. And what was Compeyson's business in which we was to go partners? Compeyson's business was the swindling, handwriting forging, stolen banknote passing and such like. There was another in with Compeyson as was called Arthur. He was in a decline and was a shadow to look at. Him and Compeyson had been in a bad thing with a rich lady some years afore, and they'd made a pot of money by it. But Compeyson betted and gained, and he'd have run through the king's taxes. So Arthur was a-dying poor, and with the horrors on him, and he soon was dead of it.
Magwitch turned his face to the fire and spread his hands on his knees.
At last, me and Compeyson was both committed for felony. Compeyson says to me, separate defences, no communication. And that was all. And I was so miserable poor that I sold all the clothes I had, except what hung on my back, afore I could get jaggers. When we was put in the dock, I noticed first of all what a gentleman Compeyson looked, and what a common sort of wretch I looked. And when the verdict come, weren't it Compeyson as was recommended to mercy on account of good character and bad company, and giving up all the information he could against me? And weren't it me as got never a word but guilty? And when we're sentenced, ain't it him as gets 7 year, and me 14? We was in the same prison ship, but I couldn't get at him for long, though I tried. The black hole of that ship wasn't a strong one. I escaped to the shore, and I was a-hiding among the graves there, envying them as was in 'em and all over, when I first seen my boy."
He regarded me with a look of affection that made him almost abhorrent to me again, though I had felt great pity for him.
"By my boy, I was give to understand as Compeyson was out on them marshes too. Upon my soul, I half believe he escaped in his terror to get quit of me, not knowing it was me as had got ashore. I hunted him down. I smashed his face. And now, says I, as the worst thing I can do, caring nothing for myself, I'll drag you back." I was put in irons, brought to trial again, and sent for life. I didn't stop for life, dear boy and Pip's comrade, being here.
"Is he dead?" I asked, after a silence.
"Is who dead, dear boy?"
"Compeyson."
"He hopes I am if he's alive, you may be sure. I never heard no more of him."
Herbert had been writing with his pencil in the cover of a book. He softly pushed the book over to me as Provis stood smoking with his eyes on the fire, and I read in it, "Young Havisham's name was Arthur. Compeyson is the man who professed to be Miss Havisham's lover." I shut the book and nodded slightly to Herbert, and naturally began to wonder, as I could see Herbert did too, whether the silent intruder following my convict was Compeyson himself. Never had I breathed, and never would I breathe, or so I resolved, a word of Estella to Provis. But I said to Herbert that before I could go abroad, I must see both Estella and Miss Havisham. On my presenting myself at Richmond, Estella's maid was called to say that Estella had gone into the country. Where? To Satis House, as usual. Not as usual, I said, for she had never yet gone there without me. When was she coming back? There was an air of reservation in the answer which increased my perplexity, and the answer was that her maid believed she was only coming back at all for a little while. I could make nothing of this, except that it was meant that I should make nothing of it, and I went home again in complete discomfiture. Another night consultation with Herbert after Provis was gone home — I always took him home and always looked well about me — led us to the conclusion that nothing should be said about going abroad until I came back from Miss Havisham's. At Satis, in the room where the dressing-table stood and where the wax candles burnt on the wall, I found Miss Havisham and Estella. Miss Havisham seated on a settee near the fire, and Estella on a cushion at her feet. "And what wind blows you here, Pip?" "Miss Havisham, I went to Richmond yesterday to speak to Estella, and finding that some wind had blown her here, I followed." I continued, "What I had to say to Estella, Miss Havisham, I will say before you presently in a few moments. It will not surprise you, it will not displease you. I am as unhappy as you can ever have meant me to be. I have found out who my patron is. It is not a fortunate discovery, and it is not likely ever to enrich me in reputation, station, fortune, anything. There are reasons why I must say no more of that. It is not my secret, but another's." As I was silent for a while, looking at Estella and considering how to go on, Miss Havisham repeated, "It is not your secret, but another's. Well?" "In humouring my mistake concerning my expectations, Miss Havisham, you sought to punish your self-seeking relations?" "I did. You made your own snares. I never made them." Waiting until she was quiet again, for this flashed out of her in a wild and sudden way, I went on, "I have been thrown among one family of your relations, Miss Havisham, and have been constantly among them since I went to London. You deeply wrong both Mr. Matthew Pocket and his son Herbert, if you suppose them to be otherwise than generous, upright, open, and incapable of anything designing or mean." "They are your friends, Pip. They made themselves my friends when they supposed me to have superseded them, and when Sarah Pocket and your other relations were not my friends, I think." Miss Havisham looked at me keenly for a little while, and then said quietly, "What do you want for them?" "Miss Havisham, If you would spare the money to do my friend Herbert a lasting service in life, but which, from the nature of the case, must be done without his knowledge, I could show you how." "Why must it be done without his knowledge?" She settled her hands upon her stick, that she might regard me the more attentively. "Because I began the service myself more than 2 years ago without his knowledge, and I don't want to be betrayed. Why I fail in my ability to finish it, I cannot explain. It is a part of the secret which is another person's and not mine." She gradually withdrew her eyes from me and turned them on the fire for what appeared to be a long time.
"What else?"
"Estella," said I, turning to her now and trying to command my trembling voice, "you know I love you. You know that I have loved you long and dearly." Estella raised her eyes to my face on being thus addressed, and she looked at me with an unmoved countenance. I saw that Miss Havisham glanced from me to her, and from her to me. I should have said this sooner, but for my long mistake. It induced me to hope that Miss Havisham meant us for one another. Now I have no hope that I shall ever call you mine, Estella. I am ignorant what may become of me very soon, how poor I may be, or where I may go. Still, I love you. I have loved you ever since I first saw you in this house." Looking at me perfectly unmoved, she shook her head. "Is it not true that Bentley Drummle is pursuing you?" "It is quite true." "That you encourage him and ride out with him?" She seemed a little surprised that I should know it, but replied, "Quite true." "You cannot love him. You would never marry him, Estella?" She looked towards Miss Havisham and considered for a moment. Then she said, "Why not tell you the truth? I am going to be married to him." I dropped my face into my hands. "Don't be afraid of my being a blessing to him. I shall not be that. Come, here is my hand." "Oh, Estella," I answered, as my bitter tears fell fast on her hand. "Oh, God bless you. God forgive you." I held her hand to my lips some lingering moments, and so I left her. All done, all gone. So much was done and gone that when I went out at the gate, the light of the day seemed of a darker colour than when I went in. Within a fortnight, I had occasion to go down to Satis again. Miss Havisham was not in her own room, but was in the larger room across the landing. Looking in at the door, after knocking in vain, I saw her sitting by the hearth and lost in the contemplation of the ashy fire. "It is I, Pip. Mr. Jaggers gave me your note yesterday, and I have lost no time."
"Thank you. Thank you."
As I sat down, I remarked a new expression on her face, as if she were afraid of me.
"I want to pursue that subject you mentioned to me when you were last here, and to show you that I am not all stone. You said, speaking for your friend, that you could tell me how to do something useful and good, something that you would like done, is it not?"
"Something that I would like done very much."
"What is it?"
I began to tell her that secret history of the partnership. When I had finished, she said,
"So, if I give you the money for this purpose, will you keep my secret as you have kept your own?"
"Quite as faithfully."
"Can I only serve you, Pip, by serving your friend? Regarding that as done, is there nothing I can do for you yourself?"
"Nothing. I thank you for the question. I thank you even more for the tone of the question, but there is nothing." She presently rose from her seat and looked about the blighted room for the means of writing. There were none there, and she took from her pocket a yellow set of ivory tablets, mounted in tarnished gold, and wrote upon them with a pencil in a case of tarnished gold that hung from her neck.
"This is an authority to Mr. Jaggers to pay you that money to lay out at your discretion for your friend."
I took the tablets from her hand, and it trembled more as she took off the chain to which the pencil was attached and put it in mine. All this she did without looking at me.
"My name is on the first leaf. If you can ever write under my name, I forgive her, though ever so long after my broken heart is dust. Pray do it." "Oh, Miss Havisham, I can do it now. There have been sore mistakes, and my life has been a blind and thankless one, and I want forgiveness and direction far too much to be bitter with you." She turned her face to me, and to my amazement, I may even add to my terror, dropped on her knees at my feet, with her folded hands raised to me. "Oh, what have I done? What have I done?" "If you mean, Miss Havisham, what have you done to injure me, let me answer very little. I should have loved her under any circumstances. Is she married?" "Yes."
It was a needless question, for a new desolation in the desolate house had told me so.
"What have I done? What have I done?"
She wrung her hands and crushed her white hair, and returned to this cry over and over again.
"What have I done?"
I knew not how to answer or how to comfort her. She had done a grievous thing in taking an impressionable child to mould into the form that her wild resentment, spurned affection, and wounded pride found vengeance in.
"Until you spoke to her the other day, and until I saw in you a looking-glass that showed me what I once felt myself, I did not know what I had done. What have I done? What have I done?"
And so again, 20, 50 times over, what had she done? When her cry had died away, I asked her, "Miss Havisham, does what has passed between us give me any excuse for asking you a question relative to Estella, not as she is, but as she was when she first came here?" I had meant to ask Miss Havisham this, and had not dared to for many years. She looked full at me when I said this, and replied,
"Go on."
"Whose child was Estella?" She shook her head. "You don't know?" She shook her head again. "But Mr. Jaggers brought her here?" She nodded her head. "Might I ask her age, then?"
2 or 3. She herself knows nothing but that she was left an orphan, and I adopted her."
She lapsed into silence. What more could I hope to do by prolonging the interview? I had succeeded on behalf of Herbert. Miss Havisham had told me all she knew of Estella, and I had said and done what I could to ease her mind. No matter with what other words we parted, we parted. Twilight was closing in when I went downstairs into the natural air. Passing on into the front courtyard, I hesitated whether to turn and look, finally, at Satis. I reached the gate, and turned at last. As I looked up at the room where I had left her, I saw a great flaming light spring up. I ran back into the house and up the darkened staircase, terror hastening my steps to Miss Havisham's door. In the same moment I saw her running at me, shrieking with a whirl of fire blazing all about her, and soaring at least as many feet above her head as she was high. I had a double-caped greatcoat on, and over my arm another thick coat. That I got them off, closed with her, threw her down, and got them over her, that I dragged the great cloth from the table for the same purpose, and with it dragged down the heap of rottenness in the midst, and all the ugly things that sheltered there, that we were on the ground struggling like desperate enemies, and that the closer I covered her, the more wildly she shrieked and tried to free herself. That this occurred I knew through the result, but not through anything I felt or thought or knew I did. Assistance was sent for. On the surgeon's coming, I was astonished to see that both my hands were burnt, for I had no knowledge of it through the sense of feeling. On examination, it was pronounced that she had received serious hurts, but that they were far from hopeless. The danger lay mainly in the nervous shock. By the surgeon's directions, her bed was carried into that room and laid upon the great table, which happened to be well suited to the dressing of her injuries. When I saw her again, an hour afterwards, she lay indeed where I had seen her strike her stick, and had heard her say that she would lie one day, when she was dead. I found, on questioning the servants, that Estella was in Paris, and I got a promise from the surgeon that he would write to her by the next post. Miss Havisham's family I took upon myself. This I did next day through Herbert, as soon as I returned to town. When Herbert had been down to Hammersmith and seen his father, he came back to me at our chambers, and devoted the day to attending on me, being the kindest of nurses. Early next morning we went out together, and by Smithfield I left Herbert to go his way into the city, and took my way to Little Britain. Although I had sent Mr. Jaggers a brief account of the accident as soon as I had arrived in town, yet I had to give him all the details now. My narrative finished, I then produced Miss Havisham's authority to receive the £900 for Herbert. Mr. Jaggers' eyes retired a little deeper into his head when I handed him the tablets, but he presently handed them over to Wemmick with instructions to draw the cheque for his signature. "I am sorry, Pip," said he, as I put the cheque in my pocket when he had signed it, "that we do nothing for you." Miss Havisham was good enough to ask me whether she could do something for me, and I told her no.
I should not have told her no if I had been you, but every man ought to know his own business best.
I did ask something of Miss Havisham, however, sir. I asked her to give me some information relative to her adopted daughter, and she gave me all she possessed.
Did she? I don't think I should have done so if I had been Miss Havisham. But she ought to know her own business best.
I told him, little as he cared for such poor dreams, that I had loved Estella dearly and long, and that, although I had lost her and must live a bereaved life, whatever concerned her was still nearer and dearer to me than anything else in the world. Mr. Jaggers nodded his head 2 or 3 times, and actually drew a sigh.
"Pip," said he, "we won't talk about poor dreams. You know more about such things than I, having much fresher experience of that kind. But now I'll put a case to you. Mind, I admit nothing."
He waited for me to declare that I quite understood that he expressly said that he admitted nothing.
"Now, Pip," said Mr. Jaggers, "put this case. Put the case that a woman held the child concealed and was obliged to communicate the fact to her legal adviser. Put the case that at the same time the legal adviser held a trust to find a child for an eccentric rich lady to adopt and bring up."
"I follow you, sir."
"Put the case, Pip, that here was one pretty little girl out of the heap who could be saved, whom the father believed dead and dared make no stir about, as to whom, over the mother, the legal adviser had this power: give the child into my hands, and I will do my best to bring you off. If you are saved, your child is saved too. If you are lost, your child is still saved. Put the case that this was done, and that the woman was cleared."
"I understand you perfectly."
"Put the case that the child grew up and was married for money, that the mother was still living and her whereabouts unknown, that the father was still living and was a convict sent for life to the colonies. Do you still comprehend the imaginary case?"
My voice quaked in my throat as I answered, "Quite."
"And finally, Pip, put the case that this convict is known to have lately returned from those same colonies, although sent for life. Put that last case to yourself very carefully."
"I do," I replied faintly. I looked at Wemmick, whose face was very grave. He touched his lips with his forefinger. I did the same. Mr. Jaggers did the same. From Little Britain I went, with my cheque in my pocket, straight to Claricas, and had the great satisfaction of concluding that arrangement. It was the only good thing I had done since I was first apprised of my great expectations. Thereupon I went home, where I found a letter directed to me. I read, "If you are not afraid to come to the old marshes tonight at 9, to the little sluice house by the lime kiln, you had better come if you want information regarding your Uncle Provis. You must come alone." I had had load enough upon my mind before the receipt of this strange letter. Nevertheless, towards our village and the marshes I now went straight, having no time to spare. It was a dark night, though the full moon rose as I left the enclosed lands and passed out upon the marshes. I knew the lime kiln as well as I knew the old battery. As I drew near to the kiln, the lime was burning with a sluggish, stifling smell, but no workmen were visible. I saw a light in the old sluice house. I quickened my pace and knocked at the door. There was no answer. I tried the latch. The door yielded. I called, "Is there anyone here?" But no voice answered. The next thing I comprehended was that I had been caught in a strong noose thrown over my head from behind. "Who is it? Help! 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 Now I've got you!" The voice I heard behind me belonged to Orlick. "Now I've got you! Unbind me! Let me go! Ah, I'll let you go! I'll let you go to the moon! Why have you lured me here? Don't you know? Why have you set upon me in the dark? Because I mean to do it all myself. One keeps a secret better'n two. Oh, you enemy! You enemy! How dared you come betwixt me and a young woman I liked?" By this I understood him to mean Biddy. "When did I asked. "When didn't you? It was you as always give old Orlick a bad name to her. You gave it to yourself. You gained it for yourself. You're a liar." He shook his heavy hand at me with his mouth snarling like a tiger's. "You was always in old Orlick's way, since ever you was a child. You goes out of his way this present night. He'll have no more on you. You're dead." I felt that I'd come to the brink of my grave. For a moment I looked wildly round for any chance of escape, but there was none. I saw that Orlick had been drinking, and his eyes were red and bloodshot. I smelt the strong spirits that I saw flash into his face. "Old Orlick's a-going to tell you something. It was you as did for your shrew sister. It was you, villain. I tell you it was done through you. I came upon her from behind as I come upon you tonight. I give it to her. I left her for dead, and if there'd been a lime kiln as nigh her as there is now nigh you, she shouldn't have come to life again. But it warn't old Orlick as did it. It was you. You was favoured, and he was bullied and beat." He drank again and became more ferocious. "I'll tell you something more. It was old Orlick as you tumbled over on your stairs that night. And why was old Orlick there? I'll tell you something more. I've took up with new companions and new masters. Some of 'em writes my letters when I want. Some writes my letters. They writes 50 hands. They're not like sneaking you, as writes but one. I've had a firm mind and a firm will to have your life since you was down here at your sister's burying. I ain't seen a way to get you safe, and I've looked after you to know your ins and outs. For, says old Orlick to himself, somehow or another I'll have him. What? When I looks for you, I finds your Uncle Provis, eh? When I knowed you at Gargery's, you ain't found no uncles then. No, not you. But when old Orlick comes for to hear that your Uncle Provis had most like wore the leg iron what old Orlick had picked up, filed asunder on these marshes ever so many year ago, and what he kept by him till he dropped your sister with it, as he means to drop you, eh? When he come for to hear that, hey, there's them that can't, and that won't have Magwitch, yeah, I know the name, alive in the same land with 'em. Perhaps it's them that writes 50 hands, and that's not like sneaking you as writes but one. Beware, Compeyson, Magwitch. I'm the
gallows!"
Then, with a sudden hurry of violence and swearing horribly, he stooped, and I saw in his hand a stone hammer with a long, heavy handle. I shouted out with all my might and struggled with all my might. In the same instant, I heard responsive shouts, saw figures and a gleam of light dash in at the door, heard voices and tumult, and saw Orlick emerge from a struggle of men and fly out into the night. After a blank, I found that I was lying unbound on the floor in the same place with my head on someone's knee. "Herbert! Great heaven! Gently, Handel. Don't be too eager. And our old comrade Startop!" I cried, as he too bent over me. Entreating Herbert to tell me how he had come to my rescue, I learnt that I had in my hurry dropped the letter open in our chambers, where he found it very soon after I was gone. Its tone made him uneasy, and he set off with Startop. They followed the instructions in the note, when suddenly I cried out loudly, and they answered the cries and rushed in. When I told Herbert what had passed within the house, he was for our immediately going before a magistrate in the town, late at night as it was, and getting out a warrant. But I had already considered that such a course, by detaining us there, or binding us to come back, might be fatal to Provis, and we relinquished all thoughts of pursuing Orlick at that time. Only one course lay before us. We must get Provis away. In London the next day, I set about hiring a rowing boat. Our plan was this. We intended to row down to the long reaches below Gravesend, where the river is broad and solitary. There we meant to lie by until the steamer for Hamburg, and then the steamer for Rotterdam, would start from London. We would hail the first, and if by any accident we were not taken aboard, we should have another chance. I felt mortified to be of so little use with my bandaged hands in the boat, but there were few better oarsmen than Herbert and Startop, and they rowed with a steady stroke.
"Dear boy," said Provis, "faithful dear boy, well done, thank ye, thank ye."
"If all goes well, you will be perfectly free and safe again within a few hours."
"Well, I hope so."
"And think so?" He dipped his hand in the water over the boat's gunwale.
I suppose I think so, dear boy. But we can no more see to the bottom of the next few hours than we can see to the bottom of this river what our catches hold of. Nor yet we can't no more hold their tide than I can hold this. And it's run through my fingers and gone, you see."
And he held up his dripping hand. We rowed on. The red sun was on the low level of the shore in a purple haze fast deepening into black. We rowed out into the track of the steamers, and soon saw their smoke. As they were coming on at full speed, we got our 2 bags ready, and took that opportunity of saying good-bye to Herbert and Startop. We had all shaken hands cordially, and neither Herbert's eyes nor mine were quite dry, when I saw a 4-oared galley with 2 men in it shoot out from under the bank but a little way ahead of us, and row out into the same track. The first steamer was nearing us very fast, and the beating of her paddles grew louder and louder. I felt as if her shadow were absolutely upon us when the galley hailed us. "You have a return transport there. His name is Abel Magwitch, otherwise Provis. I apprehend that man, and call upon him to surrender, and you to assist." At the same moment, without giving any audible direction to his crew, they ran the galley aboard of us. They had pulled one sudden stroke ahead, had got their oars in, had run athwart us, and were holding on to our gunwale before we knew what they were doing. I saw the steersman of the galley lay his hand on his prisoner's shoulder. I saw the prisoner start up, lean across his captor, and pull the cloak from the neck of the other sitter in the galley. Still in the same moment, I saw that the face disclosed was the face of the other convict, of long ago. Still in the same moment, I saw the face tilt backward with a white terror on it that I shall never forget, and heard a great cry and a loud splash in the water, and felt the boat sink from under me. It was but for an instant that I seemed to struggle. That instant passed. I was taken on board the galley. Herbert was there, and Startop was there, but our boat was gone, and the 2 convicts were gone. Presently a dark object was seen in the water bearing towards us on the tide. As it came nearer, I saw it to be Magwitch, swimming but not swimming freely. He was taken on board and instantly manacled at the wrists and ankles. Magwitch had received some very severe injury in the chest and a deep cut in the head. He told me that he believed himself to have gone under the keel of the steamer and to have been struck on the head in rising. He added that he did not pretend to say what he might or might not have done to Compeyson, but that it was certain he was drowned. Magwitch was to be taken back on the galley. Herbert and Startop were to get to London by land as soon as they could. We had a doleful parting, and when I took my place by Magwitch's side, I felt that that was my place henceforth, while he lived. For now my repugnance to him had all melted away, and in the hunted, wounded, shackled creature who held my hand in his, I only saw a man who had meant to be my benefactor, and who had felt affectionately, gratefully, and generously towards me with great constancy through a series of years. I only saw in him a much better man than I had been to Joe. Magwitch lay in prison very ill during the whole interval between his committal for trial and the coming round of the sessions. When he was put to the bar, he was seated in a chair. No objection was made to my getting close to the dock, on the outside of it, and holding the hand that he stretched forth to me. Such things as could be said for him were said, but nothing could unsay the fact that he had returned and was there in presence of the judge and jury. It was impossible to try him for that and do otherwise than find him guilty. The appointed punishment for his return to the land that had cast him out, being death, he must prepare himself to die. Rising for a moment, the prisoner said,
"My lord, I have received my sentence of death from the Almighty, but I bow to yours,"
and sat down again. The daily visits I could make him were shortened now, and Provis was more strictly kept. Then one day I saw a greater change in him than I had seen yet. His eyes were turned towards the door, and lighted up as I entered.
"Thank ye, dear boy. Thank ye. God bless you. You've never deserted me, dear boy."
I pressed his hand in silence, for I could not forget that I had once meant to desert him. He lay on his back, breathing with great difficulty. "Are you in much pain today?"
"I don't complain of none, dear boy."
He had spoken his last words. He smiled, and I understood his touch to mean that he wished to lift my hand and lay it on his breast. I laid it there, and he smiled again, and put both his hands upon it. "Dear Magwitch, I must tell you now, at last. You understand what I say?" A gentle pressure on my hand. "You had a child once, whom you loved and lost." A stronger pressure on my hand. "She lived and found powerful friends. She is living now. She is a lady and very beautiful. And I love her." With a last faint effort, which would have been powerless but for my yielding to it and assisting it, he raised my hand to his lips. Then he gently let it sink upon his breast again, with his own hands lying on it. A placid look came to his face and passed away, and his head dropped quietly on his breast. Now that I was left wholly to myself, I was falling very ill. The late stress upon me had enabled me to put off illness, but not to put it away. For a day or two I lay on the sofa or on the floor, anywhere, according as I happened to sink down, with a heavy head and aching limbs, and no purpose and no power.
Then there came one night which appeared of great duration, and which teemed with anxiety and horror. And when in the morning I tried to sit up in my bed, I found I could not do so. After I had turned the worst point of my illness, I began to notice that whoever came about me settled down into the form of Joe. At last, one day, I took courage and said, "Is it Joe?" And the dear old home voice answered, "Which it air, old chap?" "Oh, Joe, you break my heart. Look angry at me, Joe. Strike me, Joe. Tell me of my ingratitude. Don't be so good to me." For Joe had actually laid his head down on the pillow at my side and put his arm round my neck in his joy that I knew him. "Which, dear old Pip, old chap, you and me was ever the best of friends." After which Joe withdrew to the window and stood with his back towards me, wiping his eyes. When I next found him beside me, Joe's eyes were red, but I was holding his hand, and we both felt happy. I asked him about Miss Havisham. He shook his head when I then asked if she had recovered. "No, you ain't that strong yet, old chap, that you can take in more than one additional shovelful of news today. Old Orlick, he's been a-busting open a dwelling-house." "Whose?" "Pumblechook's. And now Orlick's in the county jail." I recovered my strength and health gradually, and Joe was my constant friend and attendant. Then, when one morning I got up refreshed and stronger yet, I found a letter on the breakfast table. "Not wishful to intrude, I have departed, for you are well again, dear Pip, and will do better without Joe. P.S. Ever the best of friends." What remained for me now but to follow him to the dear old forge? The purpose was that I would go to Biddy, that I would show her how humbled and repentant I came back, that I would tell her how I had lost all I once hoped for. I would say to her, "Biddy, I think you once liked me very well. If you can like me only half as well once more, I hope I am a little worthier of you than I was." Such was my purpose. After 3 days more of recovery, I went down to the old place to put it in execution. The spring weather was delicious. The sky was blue, the larks were soaring high over the green corn, and I thought all that countryside more beautiful and peaceful by far than I had ever known it to be yet. Many pleasant pictures of the life that I would lead there beguiled my way. The forge was a very short distance off, and I went towards it under the sweet green limes, listening for the clink of Joe's hammer. Long after I ought to have heard it, all was still. No gleam of fire, no roar of bellows. All was shut up and still. But the house was not deserted, and the best parlour seemed to be in use, for there were white curtains fluttering in its window, and the window was open and gay with flowers. I went softly towards it, meaning to peep over the flowers, when Joe and Biddy stood before me, arm in arm. At first Biddy gave a cry, as if she thought it was my apparition, but in another moment she was in my embrace. I wept to see her, and she wept to see me, I because she looked so fresh and pleasant, she because I looked so worn and white. "But, dear Biddy, how smart you are!" "Yes, dear Pip." "And Joe, how smart you are!" "Yes, dear old Pip, old chap." I looked at both of them, from one to the other, and then Biddy cried in a burst of happiness, "It's my wedding day, and I am married to Joe." My first thought was one of great thankfulness that I had never breathed that last baffled hope of mine to Joe. How often, while he was with me in my illness, had it risen to my lips. How irrevocable would have been his knowledge of it if he had remained with me but another hour. "Dear Biddy," said I, "you have the best husband in the whole world, and dear Joe, you have the best wife in the whole world, and she will make you as happy as even you deserve to be, you dear, good, noble Joe." Joe looked at me with a quivering lip,
and fairly put his sleeve before his eyes. They were both melted by these words, and both entreated me to say no more. I sold all I had, and put aside as much as I could for a composition with my creditors, who gave me ample time to pay them in full. Within a month I had quitted England, and within 2 months, with Herbert's help, was clerk to Clarriker & Co., Eastern Branch, and within 4 months I assumed my first undivided responsibility. Many a year went round before I was a partner in the house, but I lived happily and frugally, and paid my debts, and maintained a constant correspondence with Biddy and Joe. For 11 years I had not seen Joe nor Biddy, when upon an evening in December, an hour or 2 after dark, I laid my hand softly on the latch of the old kitchen door. I touched it so softly that I was not heard, and looked in unseen. There, smoking his pipe in the old place by the kitchen firelight, as hale and as strong as ever, though a little grey, sat Joe. And there, fenced into the corner with Joe's leg, and sitting on my own little stool, looking at the fire, was I again. "We give him the name of Pip for your sake, dear old chap," said Joe, delighted when I took another stool by the child's side. "And we hoped he might grow a little bit like you, and we think he do." "Dear Pip," said Biddy when I talked to her later, "tell me, as an old friend, have you quite forgotten her?" "My dear Biddy, I have forgotten nothing in my life that ever had a place there. But that poor dream, as I once used to call it, has all gone by, Biddy. All gone by." Nevertheless, I knew while I said those words that I secretly intended to revisit the site of the old house the next day, alone, for her sake. Yes, even so, for Estella's sake. I had heard of her as leading a most unhappy life, and as being separated from her husband, who had used her with great cruelty. And I had heard of the death of her husband from an accident consequent on his ill treatment of a horse. This release had befallen her some 2 years before. For anything I knew, she was married again. The day had quite declined when I finally came to the old place. There was no house now, no building whatever left but the wall of the old garden. A cold silvery mist had veiled the afternoon, and the moon was not yet up to scatter it. But the stars were shining beyond the mist, and the moon was coming, and the evening was not dark. I could trace out where every part of the old house had been, where the gates and where the garden. I had done so, and was looking along the desolate garden walk, when I beheld a solitary figure in it. "Estella!" "I am greatly changed. I wonder you know me." The freshness of her beauty was indeed gone, but its indescribable majesty and its indescribable charm remained. We sat down on a bench that was near, and I said, "After so long, it is strange that we should thus meet again, Estella, here where our first meeting was. Do you often come back?" "I have never been here since." "Nor I." Estella was the next to break the silence that ensued between us. "I have very often hoped and intended to come back, but have been prevented by many circumstances. Poor old place. The ground belongs to me. It is the only possession I have not relinquished. Everything else has gone from me, little by little, but I have kept this. It was the subject of the only determined resistance I made in all the wretched years." "Is it to be built on?" "At last it is. I came here to take leave of it before its change." "And you? You live abroad still?" "Still." "And do well, I'm sure." "I work pretty hard for a sufficient living, and therefore, yes, I do well." "I have often thought of you." "Have you?" "Of late, very often."
You have always held your place in my heart. And we were silent again, until she spoke. I little thought that I should take leave of you in taking leave of this spot. I am very glad to do so. Glad to part again, Estella? To me, parting is a painful thing. To me, the remembrance of our last parting has been ever mournful and painful. But you said to me, returned Estella very earnestly, God bless you, God forgive you. And if you could say that to me then, you will not hesitate to say that to me now. Now, when suffering has been stronger than all other teaching, and has taught me to understand what your heart used to be. I have been bent and broken, but I hope into a better shape. Be as considerate and good to me as you were. And tell me, we are friends. We are friends. And will continue friends, apart? I took her hand in mine, and we went out of the ruined place. And as the morning mists had risen long ago when I first left the forge, so the evening mists were rising now, and in all the broad expanse of tranquil light they showed to me. I saw no shadow of another parting from her.